Yeah, so welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca and I'll be running the how-to session for today. Have had quite a few years experience with negotiation, having competed in the junior negotiation my first year, which a lot of you hopefully will be doing this coming semester. So I'm just going to give you a presentation about what coming from a competitor that I've had both domestic and external experience in negotiation, also competed in, say, further mediation competitions, which is something which is slightly similar to negotiation, but it's an opportunity that you can look at exploring further once you have competed in, say, this competition. But it's very good introductory competition, very good competition to do in your first year, especially. I found it's something that's very good at balancing. You can balance your workload, especially when you're starting at law school, and it's when you are learning the workload that's required and you are trying to get involved in as many activities as possible. So competitions themselves are a great way to get involved in the law society and the law school. Great way to make friends, great way to also build your CV as well. And negotiation is probably one of the competitions that I did find that you can make sure you are giving enough time to so you can be successful at the competition, but also making sure that you are keeping on top of your studies and things like that. And yeah, so I will share my screen and then we can go through the presentation. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to either write them in the chat or what I probably won't be able to see, put your hand up when I'm sharing my screen. If not, I'll have time at the end for questions. So don't normally get any, but I will leave some time at the end for some questions. So I'll share my screen now. We'll start the presentation. Cool. Everyone see that? Interrupt me if you can't. But yes, so how to negotiate. Oh, that's good. So negotiation, a very broad overview of what it is. You are a lawyer acting on behalf of your client, negotiating with a second set of lawyers acting on behalf of their client. Sounds pretty straightforward. There is definitely, there's a lot more involved in that. But it's just, if you want to picture it, just have two parties kind of sitting across the table, negotiating. That's the basics of it. The problems themselves, they do vary quite a bit, but there can be quite some common themes that you'll find. They tend to be the commercial disputes, so joint partnerships, contracts. There might not necessarily be disputes per se, so there might be a bit more collaborative, not necessarily at loggerheads with each other, but there does tend to be quite a big commercial element to it. Political disputes, you do get a lot of problems between, such as like negotiating between countries. Sometimes there's a diplomatic crisis or things like that. So you do tend to get that other side of things. So people who might not necessarily have, say, an economics, commerce background or things like that, there is definitely variation of problems in that respect. In some very rare circumstances, say families, a bit more personal, but they do tend to be in the UQLS internal competitions. They do tend to follow the top two themes there. The timing of a negotiation. So the negotiation itself will last for 15 minutes and that will just be the bulk of it. So that's the main thing you're getting judged on. However, you do also have 10 minutes for private reflection with your teammate. That is to then prepare for your self-reflection. So it's almost a self-analysis, it's more for critique of yourself and your teammate. Things I'll talk about it further later, but one team will go first, but not to worry, it's not like the team that's going second will have extra time. They'll be split up, and then the next 10 minutes the other team will do their self-analysis, and then you'll get some feedback from judges and things like that afterwards, which is very important, and probably your biggest learning experience will be getting that feedback from the judges. So how does the competition work? Maybe this is kind of in the way. So the main way how the competition works is that you've got two teams. Each team will, say, participate in just the 2 rounds. And based on the scores, other teams will qualify and break for the quarterfinals. The competition will then become a knockout until the grand final. So you may have 2 rounds, so everyone will get at least 2 rounds, but it might that you might progress in the semis, there's quarters, semis, and then the grand finals. Okay, so this is probably the first substantive step. So negotiation does not require a lot of preparation compared to other competitions such as mooting. I will caveat that, but say it does really reward teams that do prepare properly and go to the extra effort. So a bit of above and beyond, rather than necessarily just doing the bare minimum. And as a judge that has judged this competition for many years, you can certainly tell in the instances where teams haven't prepared whatsoever, especially in workshop rounds. There's no expectation that you will prepare rigorously for that, but especially in those first 2 rounds, the teams that do tend to progress are those the ones that do put in the effort at the start. So if you do want to do well at this competition, I would definitely make sure that you do follow some of these things. So first and foremost, you have to read the problem, which is, I mean, not necessarily surprising. But yes, so make sure you have a good grasp of the facts. Teams, you can definitely tell when they do not have a good grasp of the facts. So either go through, read a few times, highlight it. Maybe me and my teammate, we used to prepare like a summary. So we used to prepare just a short summary of the facts, especially if they were quite lengthy ones, and making sure that we did have a very good understanding of that, because a lot of your understanding of the facts will really help inform and make sure that you are able to do the rest of the things I'll talk about later. But yeah, make sure you have that good foundation. From those, being able to identify from those facts, you'll pull out your client's interests. So things that they're wanting, things that they're interested in. Doesn't necessarily have to be a material want. It can just be things that you see there's a common theme throughout. That's something that you'll be able to do by just having to read the facts. Something else important is focus on that language very carefully. So that's what I mean by that is, I don't know, it's again in the way. Yeah. So what I mean by that is, do they need something or do they only prefer something? So there's a big difference between someone's needs and wants, essentially. So make sure you're highlighting that language. Identify and understand the other party's interests and how you can satisfy these interests while also preserving your own client's interests. So in saying that, how the competition works, if you get a set of confidential facts each, so you'll get your own confidential facts, which you will only know. The other team gets their own confidential facts. However, you will get a set of common facts. And from that set of common facts, you'll be able to identify the other party's interests, or even just, you might have to do a bit of guessing. So a little bit of guesswork, having a look at those facts, maybe filling in some of the blank spaces, thinking about what your client wants. You can get a pretty good idea of what the other party will want, especially from those common facts. So making sure you are aware of that. Recognize and identify mutual interests. That's very important. So looking at those common facts, your confidential facts, and seeing where you have some common ground. If you go into the negotiation thinking it's all very adversarial, negotiation is not an adversarial competition. It's a lot less like mooting, where you're kind of got two positions and you are trying to defend it. You are trying to look for some mutual common ground, because you'll ultimately be able to get a better outcome for your client, especially in a lot of these matters where continuing a relationship with the other party is very important. You just have to identify those mutual interests. That's very important at the first stage. Parallels of issues. Problems are written, so there tends to be about 2 to 3, 4 main issues that you need to address. So try to identify those, which when you're reading the problem, you'll be able to see quite clearly, say, what the actual issue is and what necessarily might need to discuss. Next is actually something that's sometimes overlooked, I think, in the preparation stage, and kind of done off the fly, but maybe have a think about what questions you could ask the other team and where there are gaps in the facts. So if you're looking at those facts, you're looking at confidential common facts, and you're seeing there's some gaps there, yes, that will be filled in by the team, but making sure you are asking probing questions and making sure you are getting the most out of the other team in that negotiation, because it can be better for your client in the long term if you have a full understanding what's going on, rather than essentially just 2/3 of the problem which you have been given. Clearly identify minimum and maximums for each issue. So what that means is that you'll want to look at those facts and kind of using those, what I talked about before about the focusing on the language, using that language to indicate how much of a priority that is for your client. So looking at that, and then looking within those priorities, seeing, okay, well, this is their ideal scenario. So like in the ideal world, my client would want X. However, in this problem, I can gauge that they've said this might not necessarily be possible, but I'd be happy with this. However, they've given me like a minimum. So they've said we will not accept less than X, which would be your minimum. So you need to be very aware of what your client's minimum is, especially because you in negotiation, you cannot go below that. You cannot agree to go below your client's minimum. And also have a very good idea of what their maximum is, because you want to get the best outcome for your clients and making sure you are keeping that at the back of your mind. So as I said, clearly identify the maximum and minimum for each issue. So an example, I was pulling an example from a Cook problem last year. So Cook's an external competition you can compete with. It's a Queensland-based one. So I'm not going to make you answer any questions or anything like that. But I've just got a bit of a problem. This is not a full problem. This is just a paragraph off a very lengthy problem. And within this, I'll just give you a few seconds just to read it. Being online, I have no idea when you will or will not finish, but I'll just let you read it momentarily. Actually, maybe do you want to give me a thumbs up or something, or indicate somehow when you've finished? You're at law school now, so you should be able to read that quick. So what I've got here is just, I'm going to go just kind of break it down for you, like how I would necessarily approach the problem. So in this example, you want to look what's the issue. So issue is that defense budget. So that will be probably something, an agenda item or some issue that you'll have to discuss with the team when it comes up in the problem. So it's pretty easy to identify about a defense budget. Interests. So they're a bit more difficult to identify, because if you just look at that problem, it looks like, oh, they want money. They want X, Y, and Z. So we'll look away from that language as to their minimum maximum and looking at what an underlying interest is. So wanting $430 million or no, $660 million is not an interest. What is the interest is what underlies that. Why do they want that? So asking those why questions. So the why question is, well, you can see that they need that money to maintain a relationship with Beijing, and also to avoid the financial complications and the economic consequences of not having that military budget, the amount for that military budget. So that's just something to keep in mind, that's what's driving your reasoning. That's what's driving the reason why you want to get this outcome. So rather than looking at the outcomes, look at the interest, which is what's underlying those objectives and those wants from your client. Is why do they want things? It's normally, if the problem's written well, it should be quite there, or it might not be obvious, but you should be able to ascertain it from the facts. The range, as I identified earlier. So I've made it quite clear. There's with the red underlying, so requires at least. So you're looking at, that's your minimum. So 660 million at least. So I think it's quite clear with that language, that would be your minimum. And then I've also got here, they would still like. So that sounds a bit more aspirational rather than that hard line, they require at least. So that would be your ideal maximum. So 760 would be your ideal. However, at the end it says any extra funds would be to advantage. So anything above 660, the client is looking quite positive. Anything beyond 760, very, very positive. But just kind of looking at that language and pulling it out from there. So another quick example, rather than letting you read it, I think I'll just break this one down. So this one, and you can always go back on the slides and look at it later. This one is specifically from memory, just regarding like leadership. I put it pretty broadly because there's a lot going on there, a lot about how the leaderships are rather being like president or labeling swiftly with a type of a leadership category, if you want to put it that way. Nice broad headings do help, especially when you're not entirely sure what the other party is going to say. So yeah, I would keep it broad so you can fit under the umbrella. So yeah, leadership's the issue. Interests. This one, if you have time back and read it, is probably a little bit more difficult to kind of pull out, because you might, as I said, get it confused with the outcomes that your client's wanting, not the interest. But the interest is that people of having a Mandalaya have a say in the leadership of Mandalaya. So the main interest, even expanding upon that, is kind of the idea of democracy, the idea of the power, people having the power. That's kind of what you're branching off from that interest there. And then from there, you can, as I said, manifest as direct election of the president by the people, and the removal of the, in this problem, it was the dictator. So that's the interest of that so far. Hopefully I'm making sense. Stop me if I'm not. The range, so minimum, in this instance, it's quite clear that the minimum would be to accept, say, a power sharing. So it says it could be possible. So that's kind of indicating like, okay, like at a stretch, we could do that. So a power sharing arrangement could be possible, which is indicating that is a minimum. However, as I said, it's clarified as it being in the interim. So making sure that if you do, in this instance, if you were the solicitors, you're making sure that you are, that's only an interim thing. That's not a long-term outcome. And the ideal maximum, yes, so the stepping down of the senior general stepping down, because that was their, they'd hoped, they use the words hope and the words want, quite clear there. But as I said, pulling that interest out, ultimately what is important, as I said before. And there's a little, I picked this paragraph for a reason. It says here, it says to perhaps persuade, this kind of underlined section that I have here. If you just have a quick read of that, that would be like a flag, because that was an ethical issue. I'll talk about them more later, but the underlying thing is you never want to blackmail the other team. So a problem might entice you there and be like, oh, hey, we have this information. You're authorized to use this information if you see fit to persuade them to step down. But you never really want to fall for that trap, especially in junior problems. There will be some traps there. Just avoid them. You never want to blackmail the team. So you never want to go, hey, we have this information. We're prepared to disclose it if you don't do X, Y, and Z. That's blackmail. So make sure that you don't fall for the trap. Even if your client is authorized, you are still a solicitor and you're still bound by the solicitor conduct rules in the imaginary world of negotiation here, but you're still bound. You do still have ethical duties as a solicitor, and you can't necessarily just follow blindly what your client says, making sure to keep in the back of the mind that maybe, yes, do not blackmail the other team. Okay, so the next step of your preparation, I know it's a lot, but this will all help for during the round itself. Create options. So you want to come up with solutions and options that resolve each issue while satisfying your client's interests. Don't rock up and be like, we want our maximum, and then have no fallback position when the other team is like, okay, well, we're not going to accept that. We want way lower than that. So making sure you are coming up with options and solutions. Come up with creative solutions. That's actually very favored for the judges, making sure you are thinking about creative solutions, media campaigns, different press events, things that maybe me and my teammate would call sweeteners, so things that maybe a deal for the other team might not necessarily sound ideal, but if you add, say, sweeteners or creative solutions onto them, it can come off as a lot more appealing and attractive to the other team. So making sure you're not just thinking in terms of pure numericals, you are thinking beyond that and thinking of ways that you can satisfy the other team's interests by coming up with creative solutions. Creative solutions are also great for, say, relationship building, which a lot of these problems will require you to build a relationship with the team. Pair any clauses and statements that you think the client or the client wants, making sure you are, if you are, don't just say, sign this confidentiality or NDA. Maybe if you want to go a bit above and beyond, you can't pair things, but be mindful. The negotiation is 50 minutes. The other team should be expected to be able to read that in that time. So making sure you're not going too overboard, because it's not fair just to shove a piece of paper on the team's face, be like, sign this, agree to this, when they don't have proper time to read it. So making sure you are being mindful that to not go overboard with things like that. So as I said before, offer planning is critical. So some people like doing ladders. So I tend to do like offer 1, offer 2, and we just kind of progress down there. So making sure you are ranking them obviously number one in your best interest. I won't go into mesos here. I think that's, especially with the junior competition, it's a bit much. But when you progress or you get better at negotiation, you can start looking into mesos, which are multiple equivalent simultaneous offers. It's a different strategy, but just that's another example of just planning those offers. So making sure that you are, especially if you do have that time, making sure you are focused on the key issues, ranking them, thinking of those creative solutions. It's the ladder should, as I said, reflect the best to worst options, but again, never go below that minimum. So none of your offers should ever go below, like, oh, okay, we'll go below our client's minimum. They should never go below that. Each offer should accompany justification. That's very important. Don't just say, we want this. You need to say, we want this because X, Y, and Z. The reason why you do that is because it's a lot harder to say no when people provide relevant justification. And if the other party does actually say no, then you can push back and be like, why do you not agree with these this justification? Or do you have a mutual interest we can find here? And using that justification really just sells it a bit more than just blatantly coming out with, we want this figure. All right, yes, and linking all offers objective criteria where possible. So sometimes the problem will give you objective criteria, saying like the average salary is X, making sure you are using that to be like, well, my client either should be getting at least the average salary, or my client should be getting above the average salary because X, Y, and Z. So that's using justification there because they're the leading goal scorer this season, other reasons to that effect. Economic climate can also be a market objective criteria. So how you identify objective criteria is that it's something that, it sounds pretty straightforward, but something that can't be, say, influenced, you can't influence, or is something external to negotiation. So this negotiation here happening when you're in your rounds cannot affect, say, the average salary of CEOs in Australia. Like, that's just an objective fact. So things like that are objective criteria. Same thing with economic climate, or just say certain objective facts. But as I'll caveat this, be very careful to not go beyond your facts. You can't make up facts. Don't try to bring in irrelevant facts. Bring in if the problem hasn't provided you with the average salary of CEOs, you might be borderline on bringing in external facts, which is against the rules. If you say bring in the average salary of CEOs in Australia when you haven't been provided that information. So making sure that you are using the facts provided to you, not making up numbers, being like, all right, well, making up this figure. Probably with those figures a bit more sensitive with that going beyond your facts, because it then puts the other team in a tight spot when you're bringing in external facts and making up figures, saying like, oh, this is the average, this is an objective criteria, when actually isn't something that's within the scope, the bubble of, say, the problem, and things like that. All right, this is just an example. As I said, I think Ben said he was providing, he hopefully will provide the slides or recording of this, so you can go back and look at it. But this is an example from when I did, this is when I did Quilt a couple of years ago. There was, I think, 4 offers, I think, in this, under this one issue. But that's just pretty much what me and my teammate did for our notes bring in. It's like offer 1, offer 2. So yeah, within there's different parts to it. So the private apology, bonding opportunity in offer 1, a few creative solutions in there, down the bottom with option C for offer 2, the mental health day. Sounds a bit weird when you have read the problem, ice cream and stuff. It was a very strange problem, but the point is that you are fleshing out those offers and you are providing the justification there. So all the dot points afterwards there, I've got just justification as to why we should have it, why a client wants it, and just some points there for us to prompt us. But you don't be writing out scripts. It's you're not writing out submissions or anything like that. Just make sure you have notes that if you are doing work on that preparation, you do remember on the day. All right, last one for preparation. So create an agenda. So once you've done all that, or maybe I probably wouldn't do this after making offers, but you should definitely finalize it after you've decided on your offers and your interests and things like that, is you need to create an agenda. Don't necessarily be the third step, can be the second step as well. Try to keep it to, normally it's about 2 to 3, 4 at a push. For the third item had to be pretty small, to about agenda items. And remember what I talked about before with regard to kind of the umbrella terms. You don't want to use, as I said in this last point, focus on language that you use, avoid aggressive language or agenda items that imply blame, being like, for example, your client, so the other team's clients, I don't know, you might want to say breach of the contract. You can say contract breaches, but just maybe watch out for any aggressive language used. You want to try and keep umbrella terms. You don't want to necessarily mean that the other team's necessarily going to completely reject your agenda, because as I said, this, you have to agree to an agenda between the two of you. I'll follow it up later, but you have to come to a mutual agenda. So there's no point going in with agenda items that the other team is just not going to even consider. So make sure you are keeping that in mind. I would recommend using mutual interest. That's probably an easy way to get an agenda passed. And the thing with agendas is it's quite a strategic part of the negotiation. Getting your agenda, either agreeing to the other team's agenda as a show of good faith, but also keeping in mind that the way you order things is actually very important and can play better to your client and your strategy, the way you order things. So making sure you aren't just completely conceding, oh, okay, we can use your agenda, because both teams will pair their own agendas and swap them over. But making sure you are using it as a strategy, using it as a time. The agenda time is great for asking questions. Why did you put this agenda item first? Is there a reason why is this something important to your client? So making sure you are strategizing that order. Sometimes something that you can offer in one agenda item is dependent on another agenda item, so making sure you are having the correct order, not necessarily agreeing to an agenda switch. It means you can't actually come to an agreement because you haven't sorted out the most pressing issue that your client will not agree to anything else unless that issue is agreed upon. So just keeping that in mind to agenda items. Apart from that, I would say allocate some time limits. It's been, as a judge, quite a few times, it's been quite unfortunate. Some really good teams, they've just let time get away from them and haven't addressed the most important things to their client. They end up losing the round because they just haven't been able to keep to time, haven't been able to go, well, this is actually not a priority for our client, and moving on the negotiation, making sure they are focusing on the most important things to our clients. I would allocate time limits. Don't have to stick to them strictly, but just to kind of keep you on track and just have a guide. That's an example of one that my teammate and I used. See, pretty thing, reconciliation strategy, new agreement, future partnerships. Quite broad. You can be more specific than that, can have like an A/B section. This is probably a very basic one, but nothing too long or too complicated. It's just an agenda at the end of the day, so don't go too overboard. All right, conduct and negotiation. This is probably one of the more important slides with how it's actually run. So sometimes called interviews. I'm changing the old slide, but the negotiation should be a sober affair. I would say it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. You don't have to be super serious, but you are representing your client. You aren't the client itself. You are still having to be professional and want to maintain a working relationship with the team. So obviously not getting personal, not taking it to heart that the other team maybe isn't necessarily being as flexible as you would like. Just keeping in mind that you are, in this instance, a solicitor, and as first years, you probably wouldn't have come into contact a huge amount with the ethical obligations as a solicitor, but just as a broad nutshell, you being professional, making sure that you aren't raising your voice, you are keeping in a calm, diplomatic tone, you are making sure that you aren't. Sometimes I find you can have you want a bit of rapport building with the team, you might want to exchange pleasantries, but you're not there to joke around too much. It can be quite jarring as a judge having teams laughing or giggling. Yeah, I know some people have that as a nervous tick, but just try to make sure you are keeping it professional during the negotiation. At the end of the day, you are seeking a mutually beneficial outcome. The competition is judged and scored directed towards this. I'll go on to I think this year we've released the score sheets for the competition. The UQLS team has from my reading of the rules. So this is definitely the most important thing, especially with scoring, in that funny enough, outcome is not the heavily weighted criteria. So don't just focus too much on, oh, my client has to come out on top. You are seeking a mutually beneficial outcome, because as I said before, a lot of the problems are geared to relationship building. So you shouldn't actually burn too many bridges, hopefully, during a negotiation. Make sure you're working well with your partner. It should not be that one person is speaking all the time, making sure you have approximately equal speaking time. How you decide that with your teammate is 100% up to you. Making sure maybe one person leads with questioning, maybe one person answering, up to you, but should be relatively equal. The process is you've got your introductory remarks. That's hello, greeting the team, making pre-COVID would be shaking hands. I'm not sure what they're doing this year. Greeting of the team, rapport building. Did you travel here okay? Welcome to our offices. I'm glad you found us. And things like that, just very basic pleasantries. Introduce yourself. My name's Becca. This is my associate, X, Y, and Z. Interest profiling. This is kind of something that does tend to get forgotten. Making sure you are having, this kind of goes hand in hand with that agenda setting. You can either do your agenda first and interest profiling after. They're kind of a bit more interchangeable. It's up to you what you prefer. You can set your agenda and do interest profiling before, but I do find it's good to get a clear understanding of what's your client's interests, asking it off the bat before you exchange agendas. They might be a bit cagey or hesitant to give it away. You might want to also try to frame your interest in a certain way so it's not giving too much away, but you are collaborating there. Try to find those mutual interests in that stage, so that when you come to agenda setting, you can use those mutual interests, potentially get a bit more of your way to favor your client, to be like, oh yes, considering this is a mutual interest of ours, we would see it as beneficial to discuss this item first, which is something which is beneficial to you. But yeah, using those mutual interests to your benefit as well, because at the end of the day, it is a competition. So using things like that to also advance your team. Just as I said, discuss your agenda. You have to come up with a mutually agreed agenda. So you tend to have a paper copy. For you, for the other team, I would print off, making sure everyone has a copy. No, it's not great for the environment, unfortunately, but 5 copies you should probably have. It just gets a bit confused when your people are sharing them, at least 5. I'd print 1 extra depending on how many judges there are, because it's just frustrating as a judge if there's only 1 copy and everyone's trying to lean over and try to see the copies. So if you do see how many judges you've got on, which you should see on the draw, making sure that you're giving a copy to your judges as well. Yeah, so again, these times are only guides. You have to stick rigorously to them. And then you actually go through the agenda items. You go through, after you come to an agreement on an item, you conclude, make sure to record it. The amount of times it's come to the negotiation, or I've questioned teams, and when I'm judging, and they don't have a firm grasp what they agreed to. I'm certainly probably a bit more confused than they are at that stage as to what they actually end up agreeing upon. Making sure each time you're finished that item, you've agreed upon something, make sure both teams are writing it down, like recording it, making sure the phrasing is correct, and then you can move on to the next agenda item. If you do hit a roadblock, don't spend 20 minutes on one agenda item. Say, I feel like at this stage, we're unable to come to an agreement on this particular issue. However, how do we feel about moving on to the next agenda item and potentially returning to this one when we have some more clarity with regard to the further items on the agenda? Something along those lines you can say during the negotiation. However, you don't want to be chopping and changing, jumping back and forward. So that's just to clarify that. But you can move on if you've hit a roadblock there. At the end of the negotiation, go through each agenda item, summarize. Probably 5 minutes it's a bit excessive, for about 2 to 3 minutes, because normally you're right at the end of the negotiation, you're rushing at this stage. 50 minutes goes very quickly. So yeah, get into the end, making sure you are going through, making sure everyone's on the same page, and then you can shake hands. I'm not sure what doing this year again with COVID, so maybe it's a wave from across the table. But yeah, then negotiation, the bulk of the negotiation itself is over. Ethics. This is something you should be considering throughout. It's also a question in self-reflection. Never lie. Surprisingly, it is something that you do have to tell teams. This does include misleading answers or feigning ignorance. So that means if someone asks you, do you know about, is your client in discussions with any other parties regarding this matter? As in, for this CEO position, I'll use again. You can't lie if your client has told you. However, if your client has said, do not disclose this under any circumstances, you can say to the team, unfortunately, my client has instructed me that I cannot disclose this matter. It's also an ethical breach if you do then disclose it, if your client has said, do not disclose this under any circumstances. But yeah, never lie, never say, oh no, you're the only party we're talking to, when your client's been like, oh, we've been in negotiation with the 10 other parties or things like that. So make sure you're not lying. As I said, that's folds on, never reveal information or instructed to reveal. So your client will say you're instructed not to reveal this information. Don't reveal it. Again, interestingly enough, teams do. Make sure outcomes are reasonable and within the restrictions of your client. i.e., the example, don't leave your opponent high and dry, especially if maintaining a relationship is important. So that means sometimes in your negotiation career, you might come up against teams that might be a bit more less, way to put it, like not aggressive. You don't have to be aggressive, but just a bit more flexible to the extreme. That doesn't mean you then completely back them into a corner and make them essentially, if they kind of give me all your money kind of thing, style like that. You do want to make sure that in a lot of these problems you are focusing on building a relationship. So if you went back to your client and those solicitors went back to their client and told them that agreement, how would that affect the relationship? In most circumstances, it would be pretty bad. So making sure you are obviously doing the best for your client. So you're not going to go like to bare minimum in that situation, but making sure you aren't just being outrageous in those circumstances. As I said before, use of outside information. And again, I've always said never blackmail. Private reflection. So I mentioned this before, 10 minutes, you get 10 minutes to prepare. I would take these questions in with you. These are like the really basic ones that the judges will ask you. They will ask you more than this. However, take these in, make sure you have answers to all of them. So when the judge comes in for the when you come back in to do your self-reflection, you have 6 to 7 minutes in character. So just bang, 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 tick those ones off because the judges will ask you anyway. So use that 6 to 7 minutes. As a judge, when teams use 7 minutes to just ramble, it's a really waste of time. It's like, oh, well, that's a waste of 10 minutes. Use that 6 to 7 minutes to either, I was always told it's better to be overcritical than undercritical. Better to be overcritical of yourselves than just say, oh, we did amazing, we smashed it, our client will be so happy with us. Always try to look at improving yourself. You don't have to be saying like, oh, we did horrendous, like our client's they're gonna fire us or whatever, like they're gonna yeah, don't go to that extreme. However, you do want to make sure that you aren't just blindsided by how amazing you guys were. You are thinking about critically reflecting on all those things. So how did the client feel? Think about those interests. How effective were your tactics or things you planned on in your preparation? How was your relationship with the team? Did negotiations break down a bit and you were just bartering, which in other terms means highballing, which I'm not a fan of. So if you're feeling like you're going through periods of time where you're just throwing figures back and forth, you are probably bartering, which is not what you want to do. You want to be negotiating. How was teamwork? Did one person speak over each other? Maybe if you are the person that spoke over your teammate or was a bit talkative, you do have that self-recognition and self-reflection, be like, and self-awareness, be like, okay, maybe I should take that back, because judges will be a lot more favorable on you if you do admit to your mistakes rather than just trying to cover it up, because the judges were there, they saw it, they're experienced, they know they know both sides of the facts. So they know when you're lying, they know when you haven't met your client's interests. So make sure you are very upfront about that. Ethical issues, bring up any that you potentially saw or how you avoided them or things like that. And I've added this one that's not on like the set list for Raise the Bar. But these were, what were the other team's interests and priorities? You should, by the end of the negotiation, have a good understanding. It's my favorite question to ask as a judge, because then you know how well the other teams were listening and communicating with each other will depend on how well each team understood the other party's interests, and also identifying mutual interests and things like that. And also be able to prioritize those interests, so also being able to know, oh, that was the most important thing to them. And in the next 3 to 4 minutes, the judge will ask any questions that they have prepared. All right, so this is got a few slides just to kind of wrap up the presentation with a bit more theory stuff. This is, as I said, theory, neg theory. You don't necessarily have to adopt it. However, this is more of a strategy. So when you're looking to satisfy that strategy criteria, you do want to be keeping this in mind. I'll move myself away. Okay, so there's this thing called positional versus interest-based negotiation. So positional based is probably your more kind of stereotypical stick 'em up kind of, you're just going to roll in there, get the best thing for your client and you're out. However, it doesn't always work in situations where, as I said, relationship building, but also it doesn't necessarily always mean the best outcomes. I've done a little table there comparing them. So there's heavy focus on figures, interest. You look beyond those figures. You want to look at how to satisfy interests. There's, as I said, big focus on relationship building. Positional can be quite confrontational, highballing, versus solution can actually be reached a lot quicker if you actually identify those mutual interests rather than necessarily digging in. So what they tend to, says parties tend to dig into a position. You can actually understand what the other party wants a lot more and better meet their interests and actually come to an agreement, which is sometimes not always reached, but is always good if you take the more interest-based approach. And also this competition will favor a more interest-based approach than positional from a judging perspective. Consider non-financial options is also a good thing. The key takeaway is think about interests, not positions, such as focus on underlying interests, why parties want a particular outcome, rather than focusing on a particular dollar amount or the outcome itself. The main focus is understanding everyone's interest there at the table, and you can actually leverage those difference in interests and making sure that you can say potentially satisfy something they want while also making sure you are getting what your client wants at the end of the day. This is the best. I think it was when it kind of clicked for me how to like turn the difference. There's the orange pill example. There's this book called Getting to Yes. You guys are juniors, you really don't need to be reading this yet, but just in future, if you ever want to have some further reading on negotiation, it's a good book. Not very long whatsoever. There's copies in the UQ library, or you can watch the video I've just linked in the slides as well. It's just a short YouTube video, just pretty much covers the main bits of Getting to Yes. So the orange pill example is just, there's 2 kids are arguing over an orange. So they diplomatically decide to split it in half. Both kids go home satisfied that the deal was fair. One kid eats the orange and throws away the peel. The other uses the peel to bake a cake and throws away the orange. So that's just kind of, yeah, it's never going to happen like that in real life. But it's just that kind of extreme example of when you actually look at why people want to do things. One person wants to eat it. One person wants to bake cake with the rind of it. Making sure you're not overlooking those interests, so you can actually probably satisfy both parties better if you are looking at those interests. While it might be a fair outcome, it might not be the best outcome. Yes, I'll leave that out. As I said, yeah, might not always work out that way, but just keep it in mind. This would be my last slide. Yes, the tips and tricks. Breaks. This is not really a tip. This is just a rule. Each team can call 1 5-minute break per negotiation. So if you're getting pretty stuck, your teammate are just not vibing, it's getting really heated, maybe you just need to call a 5-minute break. The clock still runs though, so keep that in mind. You don't have to use the whole 5 minutes. I would not recommend doing that. And I would also not recommend if one team calls a break, the other team calls one, because you both get to discuss in your own time. So things like that. So just call that break, making sure that you are keeping in mind, don't call a break when it's 45 minutes down and things like that. The judges also can't hear what you're talking about, or as just a clarification. Some people like spreadsheets, people who like numbers, especially when there's a number heavy problem, kind of just I've seen people have like huge tables where like they have green sections and all these are the figures we're okay with, especially when there's a lot of competing values, things like that. These are ones that are okay. And then like in red ones, we can't accept, things like that. Especially if you're not good at maths, I would recommend calculating all the different options beforehand. You can bring a calculator in. You can also use your phone on airplane mode if the judge can see it's an airplane mode and you put it on before the round. You cannot touch your phone or have any electronic devices otherwise, apart from timekeeping. Yeah, so it can serve as a quick reference as a guide. Just so, especially if you're not great at numbers, it's a very good thing to do. Strategy versus tactic. When a judge asks you a strategy, just keep in mind, strategy is the action plan that takes you there. Tactics are the way you want to go, it takes you want to go. The tactics are the individual steps, so the little building blocks will make you get there. Questioning, as I said, often overlooked, but when you ask probing questions and you make the other party justify themselves, it can either make them a bit off the back foot, like, oh, we actually have to reason, we actually have to come up with reasons why we want something rather than just saying we want something. You can also find out why other clients want something, so you can better meet their interests and overall make your client happier. If you can get a better deal from them, maybe something that wasn't really important to your client's important to the other party, you can satisfy them and making sure you get a better outcome for your client. Also good if they've got a bit of a straw man argument or something like that, to make sure you are probing that and you're not just taking things on face value. Terminology, a BATNA. So this is a very useful tool. It's not just a fancy word. So it means best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you have to think, what would the best outcome be if this negotiation was to fail? So if negotiation was to fail, maybe we progress to mediation. Maybe our client's very trigger happy and wants to proceed with litigation if this negotiation was to fail. Could also be arbitration in certain circumstances. So you want to compare all your offers against your BATNA. So is this offer better or worse than the alternative, which is going to litigation, the costs and things like that? We might not necessarily get the outcome we wanted because the court can only order certain things. So just every time you're thinking that in the back of your mind, having a good grasp of your BATNA will mean you have a good grasp of kind of what the alternative is it actually a good outcome for our client? And it'd be great if you bring it up when you're talking to, when the judges in the self-selection, be like, oh yes, we know our BATNA and we believe that all the agreement we came to today was better than that and things like that. And BATNA is just the worst alternative. I don't necessarily see the use in that. I think BATNA is definitely more important. In saying that, when I mention agreements, you don't have to come to an agreement. Like a lot of the time you might run out of time. Sometimes they go super quick, especially when you're in your first year. But don't force yourself to come to an agreement when the terms are not to your client's benefit. So don't just rush an agreement just because. You can say, okay, well, come back and hypothetically in our imaginary setting here, meet again in the future. But yeah, don't just rush an agreement because the clock's running. It's better to say, okay, at this stage, we've made this offer, you've made this offer. We haven't really come to an agreement yet, but we have identified X, Y, and Z. How about we organize a time in the future to further discuss this, rather than rushing when you're getting that 50-minute mark, where I'm like, okay, yes, we'll sign the NDA or things like that. We've seen a lot of teams do. So making sure you do want to come to an agreement, obviously, especially if it's time sensitive, your client wants it, but it's not the end of the world if you don't. And it's sometimes better off if you actually take a step back and go, oh, hang on, maybe this is not something we should rush into, in the sense of it's not meeting our clients' minimums, or it's not meeting our clients' interests. So keep that in mind. The score sheet. So this was, have a good look, it's in the rules. As I said, strategy and flexibility, that is the highest weighted criteria. So your interest and things like that will come in, your ability to identify interest, use interest, adapt. Your questioning, that's the heaviest weighted criteria. So that's why I harped on all about that. Planning procedure is weighted quite heavily as well. So keep that in mind. And outcome is the second highest. And the number of times I've had a judge to round, and it comes down to outcome and flexibility and strategy, like those two criteria, it always tends to be that always between those two. And at the end of the day, strategy and flexibility are worth more. So maybe you might have quite similar outcomes. Maybe yours is slightly not as good as the other team. However, your reasoning, your justification, your interest building, your ability to be flexible, you had a strategy, such as the kind of things I talked about with your interest-based strategies, your ability to adapt and flexible rather than necessarily just sticking on things you've prepared, being able to be like, okay, this is what the team's saying, understanding what the team is saying, that's what's weighted heavily versus reaching that desired outcome. In saying that, making concessions, as it says in the outcome, is something that you should be doing. You shouldn't necessarily, as I said, if you've come out with a maximum of every single criteria, something's gone wrong. So make sure you are making concessions when you can. And yeah, ethics is a penalty, so keep that in mind. If you breach any of those ethical things we think about, penalties are recorded as a negative. And self-reflection is a criteria in itself, so it's very important. And self-reflection is something that informs the rest of the negotiation. So if a judge is like, oh, hang on, I didn't like what they said there, but then you come into negotiation, you explain yourself, you explain your reasoning, you explain your justification, that'll actually affect the rest of the scores in the score sheet. So making sure you are keeping that in mind. So self-reflection is very important. Don't underestimate it. Where to from here? The rules are out. So I'd read those. Raise the bar. Sorry guys. I don't believe that's out yet, Ben. I'm not sure when they'll be out. He's probably the best person to ask about when that will be out. There are how-to videos next to that on the UQLS YouTube page. Have a look at that. Keep up to date with the UQLS competitions group. And have I got a response? Hopefully by the end of the week for Raise the Bar. Very important. A lot of people spend a lot of time making that. So have a read of that. Everything I said will most likely in some way, shape or form be in Raise the Bar in the negotiation section. I was quite involved in the re-editing of that section anyway. So if you've forgotten anything I've said, I believe it's being recorded as well. Feel free to go back onto that. Sorry, you'll also have your workshops. So if you can attend them, make sure you do. They're probably the best way to learn. Kind of a bit of trial and error. Just run at it, see if you can do it. You might fail terribly, but that's fine. This is then you can fail at your workshop weeks. Make sure if you are signing up to attend those workshops, they are very important. And you have time for your judges to go through this a bit more extensively. You can also contact the external competitions team. They have Jeanette is here, I believe, as well. I'm sorry, I can't see the people who were here. I believe she was here earlier. Who's running I believe is running the NEG comp this semester, or Ben as well, who is the VP comps. You can always contact him. You can always it's pretty simple email if you want to reach all of them, internalcompetitions@uqls.com. Or I think this last page works, has Ben's email address there. So if you want to email him for anything. All right, so I just spoke at you for a long time. I'm sorry about that. But